The first thing we're going to look at today is the question of, does God even want Christian lawyers? Is that something that God is bothered about, having Christians in the field of law? And the first way I'd like to answer this is to look at a collection of scriptures that are all about the fact that Jesus' domain stretches everywhere. So in Matthew 28, Jesus says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." In John 3:35, it says, "The Father loves the Son and has put everything into his hands." So Jesus' domain stretches everywhere, and we need to be rooted in that, because what we don't want is to be thinking of our work doing earthly lawyer things as unimportant, because the whole of the domain of heavens and earth belongs to Jesus. And just let me drive this home. Do you remember the scene in Luke 24 where Jesus has been resurrected and he appears to his disciples and they say, "Oh, it must be a ghost." And he says, no, touch my hand, see, I'm not a ghost. And they're still a bit unsure, so he takes a bit of fish and eats it in front of them. We see in this that Jesus has a physical body. Physical things on earth are important to God. And so therefore, when Jesus heals the blind, the sick and the lame, sure, he's doing it to give us a picture of what it will be like when he comes back and there's no more sickness or death or pain. But he's also doing it because he cares about physical, earthly things. Come with me to Amos chapter 5. "For I know how many are your offences and how great your sins. You oppress the righteous and take bribes, and you deprive the poor of justice in the courts. Therefore the prudent man keeps quiet in such times, for the times are evil." So in that passage in Amos, we're dealing with a situation where the justice system has broken down, and God cares about it. He speaks through his prophet to say, "I care about the fact that people are being deprived of justice in the courts." So in other words, law matters to God. Once we're firmly rooted in that, once we see that the scriptures show us that law is something that God cares about, then we're ready to take some steps to looking at this from some other angles as well, once we've got the scriptures firmly in mind. And the thing I'd like to encourage you to do is, there should be a button down here, if you're looking at this on the LCF website, which will let you download a handout, which is full of scriptures and quotes that I'm going to refer to. If you're not looking at this on the LCF website, go to the LCF website and then the button will be here. But the first thing I'd like to look at is a quote from C.S. Lewis, which you'll find on the sheet. And it's a peach of a quote from his book, Mere Christianity. And he says, "The application of Christian principles to, say, trade unionism or education has got to come from Christian trade unionists or Christian educators." And in a way that C.S. Lewis only can say, he says, just as Christian literature doesn't come from groups of bishops getting together and trying to write plays and books and novels in their spare time, it comes from Christian novelists. And therefore, I hope we can see there is a role for Christian lawyers, people with their hearts set on God, immersed in the field of law, to say, look, what does authentic Christian legal practice look like? And to do that, we need people with their hearts set on God and who are immersed in the field of law. Well, if that's one example of, again, why we need Christian lawyers, let me take you to another example, coming at it from a slightly different angle. There's a great book by Tim Keller called Every Good Endeavour, which is a book on the theology of work. And within that, he quotes a thought experiment by a guy called Lester DaCosta, which is from a book called Work, the Meaning of Your Life. And let me run you through the thought experiment. To my shame, I'd never thought about this properly until many years into practice, but just let me run you through the thought experiment. It goes like this. It says, imagine the chair you're sitting on. Suppose you had to build that yourself from your own work. What would you do? And you might say, well, okay, I'd go and cut a tree down. And you say, well, remember, you're doing this entirely on your own. So it's not just a question of cutting a tree. You've got to make the tool that cuts the tree. And you might say, okay, I'll make a tool and I'll cut the tree. But then you say, you remember, you're making this chair on your own. So once you've cut the tree down, you need to make a vehicle to transport the tree to the factory. And by the way, you've got to make the roads that the vehicle goes on. And the point he's making is that without people doing their job, without people who cut trees, without people who make tools, without people who make vehicles, without people who make roads, without the whole of society doing its job, the world around us very quickly unravels into a kind of chaos. And the way Tim Keller drives this home, which is beautiful, is he says the way of loving your neighbour might just be by writing parking tickets, if you're a parking warden. It might just be a way of loving your neighbour to write software, if you're a computer software programmer. And I would add, if you're a lawyer, the way of loving your neighbour might be to do your job in law well. And so doing law is something that's good for the whole of society and can be done for the glory of God. I'm going to tell you about 3 stories of real lawyers who I know who made a difference. 3 real Christian lawyers. The first one I'm going to call the lawyer who brought shalom. And I hope you know what I mean by shalom. It's the Hebrew word for peace, but it doesn't just mean not fighting. It means that there's a positive state of harmony. And I'll tell you about a Christian solicitor who I know, who I've watched him be involved in cases where, because he treats people like Jesus wants us to treat people, I've watched as he's taken parties who are in dispute, and not only have they not sued each other, but they've ended up collaborating together. Also one of the people on the other side of the case sends him a Christmas card. So there are ways in which we can, by treating people as Jesus wants, help to bring shalom, bring peace in areas where there are disputes. Let me tell you about a lawyer who stopped injustices. Quite often in commercial law, you hear this argument made of, well, we've got more money than the other side. They won't be able to keep up with the costs of this litigation, so we'll just squash them. We'll keep dragging them into court and they'll fold. And by the way, there is a terrible cancer that goes around the legal profession, which is thinking that you always need to do what your client wants. There's a terrible cancer that goes around the legal profession. But there's a Christian lawyer who I know who, when he's met with that, when he works for a client or with other lawyers who say, well, we'll just outspend the other side, they won't be able to keep up with our spending, he responds by first of all crying out and saying, "Dear Lord, please may this not happen." And then he challenges his client. He says, well, it's never quite as black and white as that, because there are places that offer pro bono help, so you may think that you're going to outspend them, but you actually won't do that. Plus, it actually makes us look a bit bad in the eyes of the judge. He might think that we're just trying to outspend them. Plus, come on, guys, why don't we just try and fight this on the merits rather than having to rely on a tactic like that? And then he cries out into prayer to God on his own, "Dear Lord, may this not happen." Now, there are today people on the other side of cases that this guy has been involved in who no duties are owed to them by him, who've not suffered injustices because his heart couldn't bear to see an injustice and he cried out to God. And the final lawyer I'm going to tell you about is the lawyer who made Christ known. And this person I've got in mind isn't a natural evangelist. He's quite English, so he doesn't like rocking the boat. But because he's worked in the same place for a number of years, and people know he's a Christian, he's had all sorts of conversations with people over the years. People have come to him and asked him to pray for things. People have raised things in conversation because, being natural, that's what he believes in. People can see that that's what drives the decisions he makes and the things he takes a stand for. So over time, somebody who we might not think of as a natural evangelist has made Christ known to people who know very, very few Christians. Well, the final point I want to make on this section about does God want Christian lawyers is that there is a real danger with the real Christians get ordained approach. I've heard it said that in previous generations there was a feeling that if you're a real Christian, you went and got ordained. And that had the effect of taking a load of lawyers, Christian lawyers, out of law and putting them in the pulpit, which we can talk about whether that's a good thing or not. And of course, I'm not saying that if you can't ever move from law into pastoral ministry. Of course, I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that we can't think that just because we have our heart set on God, the right job for us is in the pulpit rather than in the law. One thing you may want to dwell on is what would it be like if there were no lawyers at all in society? And then narrow it down. What would there be like if there were no lawyers doing your area of law? Whether that's admiralty law, shipping law, family law, whatever it is. And then drill further. What would it be like if there were no Christian lawyers doing your area of law? And the reason I'm asking this is a bit like the example we looked at of making the chair earlier. I want us to think through what would it be like if I wasn't doing my job, if there weren't people there doing my job. On the sheet, one of the things I put down that I mentioned earlier, there's a sheet you can download here. I've put down a list of good things that you can achieve as a Christian lawyer. Many lawyers find themselves in the middle of a huge, unreached mission field. Or you might be the only person in a dispute who's praying about it and seeking God in what's happening in that situation. You might be someone who helps limit the damage when people fall out, or you help draft things to stop people limiting the damage, to help limit the damage so people don't fall out as much in future. You might give good advice and help people to flourish with new initiatives. There are many, many more things, good things you could achieve as a Christian lawyer, and I've put them on the sheet. And it's worth keeping in mind as we think through what it should look like if we're doing our jobs well as Christian lawyers. Many of us will get to the point where they think, Lord God, have mercy on me. I've failed to do these things. And in which case, if that's you, run to Luke 18. Run to the story where Jesus told about the Pharisee who stood there and said, Lord, I thank you that I'm not like this man. And the one who stood beside him was a tax collector who beat his breast and said, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. Run to that, because the Lord does have mercy on us. Well, we've looked at the question of, does God even want Christian lawyers? The second question, which I'm going to deal with more briefly, is, do I know it's right for me? How do I know if this is something I should be involved in? And the scripture to keep in mind always when we're looking at issues of guidance like this is James chapter 1, verse 5, which says, if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. In other words, it's good to ask God when we need wisdom for these things. And I've put down on the sheet, there are many different ways that God will guide us and can guide us. We might be guided by logic and sort of logical processing of things. We might be guided by a sense of peace. But it's worth keeping in mind there is only one way that is completely reliable in terms of how he guides us, which is his word, the Bible. But have a look at the sheet. There are different ways in which we might get good guidance, advice from Christian friends, but there's only one that's completely reliable, the Bible. I've also put down on the sheet some resources to help us on the issue of call. It's a word lots of us have heard about and lots of different people take different views. But if that's something you want to delve into, have a look at the handout. The final thing I want to say just on the topic of whether it might be right for you is, first of all, bear in mind that most people in the world don't have a choice of where they work. And so if we find that we've got a choice about what job we're able to do, the first thing we should do is be humble and thank the Lord that we've been given a choice of where we live and where we work. The second thing I want to say is that keep in mind that difficulties at work and feeling like an alien and a stranger, that doesn't mean that you've picked the wrong job. Jesus said, if the world hates you, bear in mind it hated me first. We need to keep in mind that if we follow in the footsteps of the Master, we will feel like we are aliens and strangers where we work. But that doesn't mean that we've landed up in the wrong job. And the final thing I want to say, I think, is even if what we feel we're doing is small and tiny, in the world's eyes, it also doesn't mean we're in the wrong job. There is a lovely book written by Don Carson, the theologian, called Memoirs of an Ordinary Pastor. It's a book about his dad. It's a tribute to his dad, who was a pastor of a very small church in Canada. And the book ends like this. It says that when his dad died, there were no crowds outside the hospital. There were no announcements in the national press. There were no announcements in Parliament. But on the other side, the trumpet sounded, and his dad heard the voice he longed to hear, saying, "Well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of the Lord." If what we're doing sometimes seems small in the eyes of the world, bear in mind that we have a different audience. We're aiming to please not the world around us, but we're aiming to please one in heaven above. And to illustrate that one more time, I'm going to end with a quote from C.S. Lewis, because you've got to love C.S. Lewis, haven't you? He says, "The dentist who can stop one toothache has deserved better of humanity than all the men who think they've got some scheme for producing a perfectly healthy race." If we can take efforts to alleviate small things, that can be a great thing in the sight of God.